in the cerebrum. So in the gray matter or the cortex and in the nuclei present in the brain and the various nuclei in the other parts of the brain, you have the nerve cell bodies. White matter is where you have a collection of axons present. And these are present in different ways. So let's look at some of them. The first one is the corpus callosum. If you remember, it was an area of white matter which connected both cerebral hemispheres together. If you looked at the corpus callosum in sagittal section, this is what it looks like, okay? So there would be another hemisphere, so between the two is this corpus callosum. Here, if we are taking a coronal section of the brain, so here you can see the corpus callosum, and it's a very, very large white matter tract. It's the largest tract, and what it does is it actually connects similar functional areas of one cerebral hemisphere to the other. So for example, it connects the prefrontal cortex of the right with the left. It connects the parietal lobe of the right with the left. It connects the temporal lobe of the right with the left. So it helps to transfer information. So this is known as trans-hemispherical transfer of information. So that's the purpose of the corpus callosum. And these kind of fibers where they connect two hemispheres but similar functional areas are known as commissural fibers. Then we have fibers which connect in the same hemisphere. They connect different functional areas. So they, for example, it might connect the frontal lobe at the precentral gyrus with the parietal lobe, the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe, right? So those are known as association fibers. One really good example of how association fibers connect is, imagine you are given something to read and then I ask you to read aloud what is written, okay? So let's say I gave you this PowerPoint slide and then I tell you just read aloud what is given there. So what happens, first thing is that when you're looking at the slide, the information, since it's vision, it goes to your occipital cortex. So let's pretend somewhere here is the occipital cortex. So it goes to your occipital cortex. Then you have to understand what you're reading, right? So from the occipital cortex, association fibers will take it to the Wernicke's area. Remember, Wernicke's area was sensory speech, where you comprehend what someone is talking to you or what you're reading. So it will go to the Wernicke's area in that lobe of the brain, in the temporal lobe, which is where mainly it is there. Then from there it will go to the Broca speech area, because my directions to you were read aloud what you are seeing on this slide. So it goes to the Broca speech area, which is for motor speech, and then that Broca's area will connect to that part on the precentral gyrus, which is the motor area which has to do with your lips and your tongue so that you can articulate your words. So here, can you see how different functional areas are being connected to one another? So these are called association fibers. And then we have fibers which connect the brain, which is known as the higher centers, all the way down to the spinal cord. So these travel between the brain and the spinal cord. So these kind of project from one area down to another. So these are known as projection fibers. So these are all white matter fibers. When they are collected together, if you remember, we also call them tracts. And we'll be seeing these tracts as we go along. So some of these fibers you'll see that they are named tracts. Others may just be called fibers. For example, corpus callosum we just say as commissural fibers, or fibers which are connecting different functional areas, we just call them association fibers. And some of these projection fibers, you'll see later, we kind of call them tracts. So they go all the way down to the spinal cord, connecting higher to lower centers. Now let's do a little review of some of the things that we've done so far. So let's say you get a question like this about Stacy, who can't understand what is being said, but she articulates words properly. So which area do you think is affected? This is the Wernicke's area. See this word, cannot understand. Remember sensory speech. That was Wernicke's area, was the area where you can comprehend what is being said to you or what you are reading. But her speech is normal. Remember I gave you that example. She's able to talk, this person is able to talk normally, which is motor speech, which is Broca's area. So here it is a question of comprehension. So Wernicke's area is what is involved. You can't say the entire temporal lobe. So since you have a better choice, which is Wernicke's area, that's why this is the correct answer. So let's look at this question. So you're hurt at the back of your skull. Which area is most likely to be affected because of this? Very good. Loss of a field of vision. You hit yourself in the back of the head. It's the occipital bone up here. Occipital lobe is there. And remember, this lobe was responsible for vision. And I told you that it was not responsible for vision of, the left eye doesn't go to the vision from the left eye doesn't go to the right occipital cortex. It's actually a field of vision. So it was the field of vision which is lost. So here's another one. So I'm kind of trying to go back and review the functional areas of these various lobes. Parietal lobe, yes, that function of being able to identify a familiar object placed in your hand was called? What was that called? Stereognosis, yes, stereognosis. So it was, by touch you can tell that. And remember, parietal was to do with touch. So this is stereognosis. So her parietal lobes, an area there, would be affected. Okay, so here is about cerebrospinal fluid. Foramina in the fourth ventricle, yes. Choroid plexus forms cerebrospinal fluid. It circulates in the ventricles, passes through the foramina in the fourth ventricle. There's one central and two lateral, goes into the subarachnoid space, and then through the arachnoid villi, it is reabsorbed into the venous sinuses. So foramina is the connection. The only connection is between the fourth ventricle and the subarachnoid are these foramina which are present. Okay, so let's look now at the other parts of the brain. So here we are looking at an area called the diencephalon. it has three main parts to it. An egg-shaped area here, which is called the thalamus. Below the thalamus is a part which is known as hypothalamus. That's why hypo, because below. And then there is an area posteriorly which is called the epithalamus, of which in the epithalamus the pineal gland is the main structure which we are going to be looking at. These three areas, the thalamus, hypothalamus and epithalamus, these areas are related to the third ventricle. So here actually the cavity of the third ventricle has been opened up because it's between these two, the diencephalon of one side and the diencephalon of the other. So these areas form the lateral wall of the third ventricle. So when you cut it through, then you open up the ventricle. So this is the opened ventricle that you're seeing. Let's look at some of the function of these areas. The thalamus is the main sensory relay station. By that I mean, it's like, imagine like a toll plaza up there. So if this is the brain and the spinal cord, and let's say here is the hand. And sensations, so you know, any sensation from the hand has to go to the parietal lobe. Remember, the parietal lobe was the sensory area, right? The post-central gyrus. So somewhere here, let me say, is the thalamus. I'm going to draw the thalamus like this. So from here, so we'll forget the sides because remember, it goes to the opposite cortex. So we'll just go like this. Oops. So from the hand, the fibers go, you know, they travel, they do all kinds of things, and they travel up. Then they actually, all of them will relay. That means they'll stop in the thalamus, synapse there, and then the final pathway from the thalamus will be to the sensory cortex. Okay? So all of these sensations make a stop in the thalamus. So that's why it's called the main sensory relay station. Attached to the thalamus, you have two round structures which are known as geniculate bodies. The genu means like a knee, so they have kind of a bend like a knee. So these are geniculate bodies. So these are relay centers for auditory, that means for hearing, and for vision. So sensations of hearing will go to the geniculate part. So from the ear, sensations will travel and they'll go to this geniculate part, and then from hearing they'll go to the temporal lobe because the temporal lobe is concerned with hearing. So the geniculate bodies then become that relay station. For the visual pathway, so from the eye, they will go to one of the geniculate bodies, and then after relaying there, they'll go to the occipital cortex. So these are relay stations for vision and for hearing. This thalamus is also connected to many other areas of the brain, and it acts like a mediator. It kind of makes sure that the information coming to it and the information which is being relayed to the other areas of the brain and the response to that information is all kind of accurate. So it acts like a mediator. So these are some important functions of the thalamus. When we take the hypothalamus, it has a lot to do with our body functions. One is, it's known as the thermostat of the body. If you remember, when we first did the introductory lecture, we talked of if it was very cold outside, that is sensed by the hypothalamus and accordingly changes, you know, it makes sure your body temperature is kept constant. If it's very hot outside, again, the hypothalamus senses that and then it brings about certain actions like, you know, you sweat and all that. So this is the body thermostat. It also controls thirst. It controls your sleep-wake cycle, which is known as the diurnal rhythm. It controls a lot of the visceral activity which goes on inside. So a lot of homeostatic functions. So it has a lot of homeostatic functions. So it maintains homeostasis. So autonomic nervous system has to do a lot with activity of the organs, and this is under the influence of the hypothalamus, like the way your heart, lungs and all that functions. So the hypothalamus influences that. The hypothalamus also produces hormones, and these hormones either act on target organs, and some of these hormones act on the pituitary gland. So actually initially they used to call the pituitary the master gland, but now we know that it's the hypothalamus which is the master gland, because it controls the pituitary and also it produces its own hormones which act on target organs. So that's its endocrine function.
Does it control the thyroid?
Yes, it controls all the endocrine glands. A lot of the endocrine glands are, because the hypothalamus produces a hormone which controls the pituitary, and the pituitary produces a hormone which controls the thyroid. So you see, it's like a stepwise action. And it is also connected, the hypothalamus, to a particular system which is called the limbic system, which the limbic system is like the emotional brain. So this hypothalamus is connected to that. So that's why it controls emotions and certain biological rhythms within us. So a lot of action, as you can see, to do with visceral activity. That means your body functions, like, maintaining temperature, keeping sure that you are well hydrated. So it's the thirst center, controlling autonomic activity, endocrine function. So a lot of activity where organs and glands are included. The epithalamus, of which, as I said, the pineal gland is the main structure which we are going to look at. So this pineal gland secretes a hormone which is called melatonin. And melatonin regulates the sleep-wake cycle. More melatonin is produced during the dark periods of the day, so during night, and less during the daylight. So it kind of makes sure that you stay alert during the day and, sleep during the night. So these are functions of the diencephalon. Then below the diencephalon, so up here if we look, so here is the diencephalon. Below that, this area here is the brain stem. And we are looking at a sagittal section here. So this part is the midbrain, pons and medulla. And if we look now, the same thing from the ventral aspect, this is part of the diencephalon. So here is the thalamus, and then the hypothalamus is up here. So here is the brain stem, which consists of the midbrain, the pons and the medulla. And I also want you to see that most of the cranial nerves arise from the brain stem. So we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. From 3rd to 12th, they arise from one or the other part of the brain stem. The first and second arise from close to the cerebral hemisphere itself. So the brainstem consists of these 3 parts. So let's look at each one individually. The midbrain, which is the superior most part of the brainstem, its cavity is the cerebral aqueduct. So if we go back here, here is the midbrain. This is the ventral aspect of the midbrain. This is the dorsal aspect, and the cavity here is the aqueduct. So here we are looking at the ventral aspect. The dorsal is behind. We can't see, so the cavity will be inside. This ventral aspect which we are looking at is known as cerebral peduncle. Peduncle means like a big tree trunk. So this part of the midbrain is called cerebral peduncle, and the motor fibers which travel from the precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe, so those motor fibers will travel. So imagine if the frontal lobe was up here on this side. So those fibers travel all the way down, and they actually travel in the cerebral peduncle. Also, it has 2 swellings on its posterior aspect. You can't see it from here because this is the ventral view. If I go back, these 2 little swellings, can you see these 2 little swellings? These 2 swellings are called colliculi, or also known as corpora quadrigemina. So these swellings, which are seen on the dorsal aspect, so if I turn this around, we would see that. Those colliculi are relay centers for auditory pathway and vision. Just like we had those geniculate bodies in the thalamus, similar to those geniculate bodies, these colliculi in the midbrain are also relay centers for auditory pathway and vision. In other words, to hear, first the impulses will go to the midbrain, then from the midbrain they'll go to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus they'll go to the temporal lobe, which is the hearing center. For vision, they'll go to the midbrain, to the colliculi, then they will go to the thalamus, the geniculate body, and then they will go to the occipital lobe, which is the center for vision. So they kind of make a stop at these areas. So midbrain as well as the thalamus are concerned with the with auditory and visual pathways. Cranial nerves 3 and 4. The third is called oculomotor. The fourth is known as trochlear. When we do the peripheral nervous system, we'll talk about that. These arise from the midbrain. So here, if we look at the midbrain, the ventral part of the midbrain, this is the third cranial nerve here. And this on the side, lateral side, is the fourth cranial nerve. So you can see the third and the fourth arising from the midbrain. All of the brainstem is connected to the cerebellum by little tracts or limbs. Those limbs again are called peduncles, like trunks, little limbs. So since the midbrain is the highest part, so imagine here is the cerebellum. And if I just draw the midbrain up here, here is the pons, and here is the medulla. All these three are connected to the cerebellum. The reason is because you have so many cranial nerves coming out from these areas. Also, you have motor fibers traveling from the frontal lobe down the brainstem. You have sensory fibers going up to the brain through the brainstem. So in order to kind of coordinate a lot of muscle activity and also look at sensory impulses, these three areas of the brainstem, they connect with the cerebellum. So they kind of send to and fro information to the cerebellum, making sure that the cerebellum is aware of what impulses are going to go to the brain and how the muscles are acting. And that's how it's able to do its job harmoniously. So if we have three sort of limbs which connect the brainstem to the cerebellum, the topmost will be called superior peduncle, the middle will be called middle cerebellar peduncle, the lower one will be called inferior cerebellar peduncle. Since the midbrain is the superiormost part of the brainstem, it is connected to the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle, and so it has to and fro information going from it to the cerebellum, information to and information from, just making sure that everything is coordinated very well. Okay? The second part of the brainstem is the pons, whose cavity is the fourth ventricle. So here is the pons, this one is the pons, so that's why I drew it here. It is connected to the cerebellum by the middle cerebellar peduncle. So here, this part here is the middle cerebellar peduncle. And here you can see the pons, and this is the middle cerebellar peduncle. Cranial nerves 5 to 8 arise from here. So we'll go back here. The fifth cranial nerve arises, it's the thickest nerve. It arises about the middle of the pons. So here's the fifth cranial nerve. The sixth cranial nerve arises at the junction of the pons with the medulla. So the sixth is in the midline. The seventh is further laterally. And the eighth is lateral most. So we have fifth, sixth. So here is the fifth. So here is the fifth. This is the sixth, seventh, and eighth. So we go sixth is medial, eighth is lateral most, and seventh is in between. So these three arise at the pontomedullary junction. 6th to 8th. This is connected, as we said, to the cerebellum. It is also connected to the motor cortex. So it kind of helps to transmit information between the two, between cerebellum and the motor cortex. It also has the vital respiratory center here. So respiration is controlled through a center which is present here in the pons. That's called the respiratory center. The medulla oblongata is the lowermost part of the brainstem, which is this area. So you can see that it has a central sulcus, two swellings on the side, and then another swelling further laterally. This swelling which is present just next to the sulcus, this swelling is called the pyramid. And a little swelling which is present further laterally, which you can't see in this picture, but you can see up here. So this swelling which is present further laterally is known as the olive. this is connected to the cerebellum by the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So I don't have it written here. The medulla is connected to the cerebellum by the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So this is connected by inferior cerebellar peduncle. This is connected by middle cerebellar peduncle. So all of the brainstem is connected to the cerebellum. The medulla also, like the rest of the brainstem, connects the cerebral cortex with the spinal cord. And what happens is that from the motor cortex, fibers travel down in order to go to the spinal cord. But if you remember, we said that the brain controls the opposite half of the body. Remember, the contralateral part of the body. So the fibers from the right, so if we say that this is the right cerebral cortex and this is the left cerebral cortex, the fibers from the frontal precentral gyrus will travel. They'll keep traveling on the same side. They'll travel on the same side. They pass through the midbrain, pons, and when they come to the medulla, in the pyramid of the medulla, they cross over to the other side. So they cross over to the other side, and then now they are traveling on the left side, and then they'll go to the spinal cord on the left side. So that's how the right cerebral cortex controls the left side of the body. Okay? So this crossing over occurs in the medulla and in the pyramid of the medulla. The 9th to the 12th cranial nerves arise here. So again, if you go to this picture, so in the pons we had the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. In the medulla laterally we have 9th above, 10th in the middle and 11th below. And then 12th is medial. So medially we have 12th, 9th, 10th and 11th present laterally. So we have 9th to 12th present arising from the medulla. And the medulla has, like the pons, it has the respiratory center, but it also has the cardiovascular centers. So this is a very, very important area. If there is bleeding and that bleeding occurs in the medulla and it compresses these vital centers, death can ensue. In fact, during those days when people used to they used to have death by hanging, the dents, when you hang a person, the dents of the axis vertebra that breaks off, and that dents goes and pushes against the medulla and it kind of compresses the vital centers, which is why death is almost instantaneous, because it knocks off these vital centers. So you can see that the brainstem is a very, very important area, and you're always worried about hemorrhage in the brainstem because it can jeopardize all of these vital centers, plus interfere with all these cranial nerves which are arising from that, the majority of the cranial nerves. The cavity of the medulla also is the 4th ventricle. So here are those connections of the brainstem that I was talking about. So I said, that brainstem is below the cerebral cortex or the cerebral hemisphere, but it is connected to them. So let's look at sensory and motor fibers. Sensory means going towards the central nervous system. Motor means coming away from the central nervous system. Sensory fibers, they go towards the central nervous system, but they have to travel all the way up to go to which lobe of the brain is responsible for receiving sensation. Which lobe of the brain is responsible for receiving sensation? Pardon? Very good. Parietal lobe of the brain, right? So it has to go to the parietal lobe. So if it is coming, imagine if it's coming from, if any sensation, let's say we draw a person up here, sensation coming from the limbs. So from here, the sensation will travel into the spinal cord. It will have to travel all the way up and then go to the parietal lobe, right? So it has to travel up. That means like climbing a ladder. So sensory fibers in the central nervous system, therefore, are also known as ascending tracts. Remember, a collection of fibers was called tracts. These are called ascending tracts. Now imagine if information has to go to muscles of the lower limb. It will have to come through the motor area of the cerebral hemisphere. Which lobe of the brain is responsible for controlling voluntary muscle activity? Frontal. Remember that prefrontal gyrus, right? So from that prefrontal gyrus, the impulses will have to travel down, and then they exit the spinal cord, and then they will go to, the limb. So these fibers are traveling all the way down and then going out. So motor fibers are also called descending tracts because the impulses come down, whereas sensory fibers, impulses are going up. Okay? So let's take a look at these connections of the brainstem and see how they are connected. So up here, this is showing you this area is a section of the spinal cord. These two are sections of the medulla. These two are sections of the pons, and this is a section of the midbrain. So this is the brainstem, and up here, let me put the thalamus, because remember the thalamus was an important sensory relay station, right? So here's the thalamus. So here, look at this. So here is an impulse, and let's say that this is the right side and this is the left side. So here is an impulse coming in, a sensory impulse. Let's say this is the upper part of the spinal cord. So let's say somewhere on the upper limb, some sensation coming from the upper limb comes into the spinal cord, and it crosses over in the spinal cord to the other side. So this is coming from the left side. Notice now it has gone to the right side because it's crossed over. Then it travels in the medulla. It travels through the pons. It'll travel all the way through the midbrain. It has specific areas where it is traveling. And then when it reaches the thalamus, it will synapse there. And from here, it will go to the right parietal lobe. Okay, so right parietal lobe. So can you see the right parietal lobe is therefore controlling the left side of the body, or receiving sensations from the left side of the body. In order to reach that, look at how these fibers have to travel all the way through the brainstem. So if there was a problem in the brainstem, you understand that these sensory fibers could get interrupted, okay? Meanwhile, as it is traveling, the brainstem is also connected to the cerebellum. So what it does is it sends some kind of little branches to the cerebellum, keeping the cerebellum informed about, hey, you know what, I'm carrying these sensations up to the cortex. You need to know about these sensations that I'm carrying, okay? Look at motor fibers, same way. So if we say that this was the right side and this is the left side, and from the right frontal lobe, imagine all the impulses started. So they travel all the way down through the diencephalon and all that. And they travel down the midbrain, they travel down the pons, they come into the medulla. So they're still on the right side. In the medulla, these then begin to cross over. So can you see this crossing over in the medulla? So from the right side, now this tract has crossed over and come to the left side. From here, it will come and synapse in the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord, the fibers will go out to muscles on this side. So therefore, right motor cortex is finally controlling left side of the body. So can you see how the cerebral cortex controls the contralateral side of the body, okay? In this situation, fibers were going up. They were going towards the central nervous system. We call them sensory or ascending. Here they were coming from the central nervous system going out. So they are called motor because they travel down. They are known as descending. Followed? Let's look at the cerebellum. This, unlike the cerebral cortex, controls the same side of the body. So its control is it makes sure that muscle tone is harmonized. That means whatever action you perform, it's not done in a jerky manner. You can perform the action very quickly. If I ask you to supinate and pronate your forearm, you can do it really fast, which you do when you screw on a bulb or you're doing some carpentry or anything. If I ask you to touch your finger to your nose, and you can do it really fast without any jerkiness or anything like that. So it makes sure that your muscle tone is harmonized. If you're looking, for example, you want to look at something which is in front of you, and then you want to look at something towards the right or left or down, it makes sure that your eye muscles coordinate well, and you can, one eye looks left and one eye looks the other way. So all of this is done in a very harmonious manner. So it makes sure that muscle movement, also muscle tone, that means your muscles don't feel flabby, all of this is harmonized. It also controls your posture and your gait. So, you know, you walk and stand erect and you're able to walk on a narrow base, like, you know, you can put one foot in front of the other and walk. You don't kind of spread your feet apart and walk to balance yourself. You're able to do that. Your muscle movements are coordinated, well done. All of this it does by controlling the same side of the body. So when something controls the same side of the body, that is known as ipsilateral control. So if the cerebellum, if the right cerebellum is gone, then the right side of the body, you would have problems. So, you know, your skeletal muscle movements would not be coordinated. So if I asked you to do pronation and supination quickly, the person would not be able to do it on the right side. Say the right cortex was involved. They would do it really, really slowly. So they won't be able to do it. They'll be doing this. If you ask them to touch their finger to their nose, you know, the finger will shake when they touch. They may not even be able to make it to their nose. They know where their nose is. They know where their finger is, but it'll just kind of go across. So muscle tone and harmony is gone. It accomplishes all of this because it is connected to the cerebrum, it's connected to the brainstem, and it's connected to the spinal cord. So what it does is, it gets information from all these areas, and it makes sure that whatever information it is getting and whatever information is being sent out, both of them match each other. So for example, if your intention is to touch your finger to your nose, the cerebellum coordinates this action. It makes sure, if it's functioning normally, that your finger comes and touches the nose only. It doesn't kind of go way across, like you don't go to the ear first and then come back, right? So you don't overreach. So when the cerebellum is damaged, this coordination goes. You're still able to use your muscles, but they're not coordinated. So muscles are not paralyzed, but they're just not coordinated. So, you know, you get these jerky movements. People are not able to balance themselves properly, so they always walk on a broad base. So that's known as ataxia, because they can't control their balance, since this is an important part of the brain which controls balance. When you take a look at a cross-section of the cerebellum, which is seen up here, the gray matter, like the cerebral cortex, is peripheral. The white matter is in the center, and the white matter kind of goes in like a fern pattern or a tree-like pattern. So that pattern is known as the arbor vitae pattern, okay? And here are the three peduncles, the superior, middle, inferior, which connect the cerebellum to the brainstem. So that's how it's kind of getting information from the brainstem as well, and making sure that everything that goes or comes from the cortex and goes or comes from the spinal cord, everything is coordinated. That means whatever information is projected and whatever the intention is, they match each other. If the cerebellum is damaged, this coordination goes away. Now let's look at the blood supply of the brain. The brain is such an important organ that you have to make sure that the blood supply is always constant. You don't want there to be any time in the body where the blood supply could be jeopardized. So with the result, you have an anastomotic circle. Anastomosis is where blood vessels meet each other. So we have an arterial anastomosis called the circle of Willis. The two main arteries which participate in this circle of Willis are the internal carotid artery and the vertebral artery. So this is often called the vertebrocarotid system. So if you take a look at these arteries, and you don't need to, I only want you to remember internal carotid and vertebral, but take a look at this system. So this is that circle of Willis which is formed. So here see the two vertebral arteries. So here are the two vertebral arteries. They join together to form a single artery which is called the basilar artery. This artery then divides into two, which is called the posterior cerebral. So one part of the circle will stop here. So that's the vertebral part. This is the internal carotid artery of either side. As soon as it gets into the skull, it opens, branches, it has two branches. One is called middle cerebral and one is called anterior cerebral. So here's one middle cerebral, here's an anterior cerebral. These two anterior cerebrals are connected to each other by a small blood vessel. So that's the internal carotid part of the circle, and here is the vertebral part of the circle. Now, to complete the circle, here you can see this middle cerebral is connected to this posterior cerebral by a little artery up here. So you have a whole arterial circle present. So if one part of the circle is blocked, you can see that blood can always reroute itself and come the other way, making sure that no part of the brain ever suffers from lack of blood supply, unless a big major artery is totally blocked, okay? Now, in this circle of Willis, it's not uncommon to find areas where the arterial wall is dilated. When the arterial wall is dilated, that condition is known as an aneurysm. So it is like the ballooning of an artery. These little dilations, so imagine if you had these little kind of swellings up here, looking like little berries, these are called berry aneurysm. What do you think would be, if somebody had berry aneurysms present in this circle of Willis, what would you be worried about in this case? What do you think can happen to these dilated blood vessels? Exactly, they would rupture, right? So it's not uncommon to find a hemorrhage in the brain because of a rupture of an aneurysm. So whenever it is discovered, you're always worried. You keep a watch on it, and you make sure if it's large, you do something called coiling, where you kind of put a little coil inside to completely block that, so that it doesn't rupture. Okay. So that was the brain and all its parts. Now let's look at the spinal cord. Present in the vertebral canal, it begins at the foramen magnum, and it doesn't extend all the way till the end of the coccyx. It ends in adults at the level of L1 and L2 vertebra, the disc between L1 and L2 in adults. In children, it's a little lower down. It ends at the level of L3 vertebra in children. Just like the brain, it has these meninges which are present, and it has a subarachnoid space as well, just like the brain was surrounded by the subarachnoid space. This subarachnoid space extends a little lower down. It goes till S2 vertebra, that means the sacral 2 vertebra. Now, in the brain, you remember you had a space outside of the meninges, which was called the extradural space, or also known as epidural space. This was also known as epidural space. Surrounding the spinal cord is also a space outside the dura mater called epidural space, which is where you sometimes inject anesthetic fluid when you want to do anything, to any surgery which is done in the perineal area. This epidural space in relation to the spinal cord is rather large. Unlike the brain, this one is much larger. So it's a pretty big space where you can inject substances, especially anesthetic fluids. Where the spinal cord ends, that area is conical in shape. It's called conus medullaris, and then we'll see a sheaf of nerve fibers which are present. We'll also see areas where the spinal cord is enlarged, and it's enlarged in these areas because this is where the limbs are. Since the limbs arise in these areas, there are more muscles in that part, so you need more gray matter. So that's why you have these enlargements in the cervical and lumbar areas. And we'll see that there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and we'll also talk about lumbar puncture. So let's look at some of these things. So here is the spinal cord. So here is the spinal cord surrounded by the same meninges that you see up here. So the dura mater is outside, then is arachnoid, and pia mater completely encloses the spinal cord. So this here is the subarachnoid space. Outside the dura mater, this space is the epidural, or what is also called extradural space. Epidural, epi means outside of the dura mater, epidural or extradural space. So this epidural is also extradural space. So in this extradural space, you have you can see fat and you have blood vessels. So it's quite a wide space. You can inject substances into it. So let's see here. So this is a section. Also notice one thing. Look at the gray matter. The gray matter is in the center, unlike the brain. The gray matter was in the periphery. Remember the cortex. Here the gray matter is in the center and the white matter is peripheral. The gray matter kind of looks like butterfly shaped. So we'll be describing that as well. So here is the entire spinal cord in the vertebral canal. So here it is in the cervical region. There is more gray matter. It's enlarged. In the lumbar region also more gray matter enlarged over there. Here are these nerves, the spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of these spinal nerves which come out. And here at the level of L1 in adults is where the spinal cord ends, and where it ends, it looks like a cone. So this is the ending. So that's why that area is called conus medullaris. And from the conus medullaris, a thin filament covered, which has very little nervous tissue and covered by pia mater, a thin filament comes down and attaches it to the back of the coccyx. This kind of stabilizes the spinal cord within the vertebral canal. That thin filament is, think of it as the terminal filament. So it's also known as filum terminale. Okay. Filum terminale extends from the conus medullaris all the way to the tip of the coccyx. All these, from this spinal cord, the spinal nerves come out. So there are, for example, 8 cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal spinal nerve. All of these nerves come out through the intervertebral foramina. Now the cord has ended at L1, but the spinal nerve L2 will have to come out through the intervertebral foramen. The spinal nerve 3 will have to come out through the intervertebral foramen lower down. The sacral spinal nerves will come out through the intervertebral foramina in the sacrum. The coccygeal spinal nerve will come out through, and again, an intervertebral foramen. So all these spinal nerves, since they have to travel lower down, after the cord is ended, the remainder of this vertebral canal has just this sheaf of spinal nerves, which looks like a horse's tail. So we call it cauda equina. Cauda for tail, equina for equinus or horse. So the remaining sheaf of spinal nerves after the conus medullaris, that's what remains in the subarachnoid space, which ends at the level of S2. So they travel in that, and they are, sort of floating around in the subarachnoid space. Now, if you want to do a lumbar puncture, obviously you don't want to do a lumbar puncture above L1, because if you did a lumbar puncture and went through any of these regions, what would happen? You have this solid cord over there, so you can kind of pin the cord and damage it, right? However, if you do a lumbar puncture below L1, after the cord is gone, you only have this sheaf of nerve fibers. These nerve fibers, these nerves are very thin, and they will move out of the way. So you can't kind of pin any one nerve in that. It's not like one solid structure. So therefore, when you do a lumbar puncture, which may be done for diagnostic purposes, or it may be done where you inject anesthetic fluid, where you give spinal anesthesia, where you inject anesthetic fluid within the subarachnoid space, you do it below L2, because the cord ends between L1 and L2. So you have to do it below L2 in adults and below L3 in children. So you do it below L3 in children. The idea being you will not pin one single nerve. It's so difficult to catch one nerve and pin it down. So the nerves kind of move out of the way. You can withdraw your cerebrospinal fluid if you want for diagnostic purposes. You can inject anesthetic fluid up there, and you're safe. You're not going to damage any structure. So that's where you do a lumbar puncture. Now when we take a section of the spinal cord, we will notice that ventrally we have a thin fissure, and dorsally we have a kind of a deeper sulcus. The gray matter, as I said, is in the center. The white matter is peripheral. The gray matter is present as projections, which are known as horns. So there are 3 horns which are present. Each of the horns is responsible for different functions. So for example, the ventral horn is responsible for carrying motor neurons. The dorsal horn carries, and the other areas carry multipolar interneurons. The lateral horns have autonomic neurons. So the lateral horns are not seen everywhere. They're only seen from thoracic 1 to lumbar 2, and in the sacral 2 to 4 segments of the spinal cord, you'll see these lateral horns. So they have autonomic neurons. So when we do the autonomic nervous system, we'll kind of be talking about that again. And then we'll also see how the spinal cord is connected to the spinal nerves. So we have roots by which it is connected, and then the spinal nerves have both sensory and motor fibers. So you can kind of read through all of this. I'm not going to kind of just read over, but I'm going to show you these areas. So here let's look at the spinal cord. So here's a section of the spinal cord. This is posterior and this is anterior. So here is a little fissure and this is a deep sulcus. Here notice this H-shaped gray matter present, and this which is central, and the white matter is present around. So white matter is peripheral whereas gray matter is central. Where is the central canal lying? Yes, from looking at that picture, where is that central canal lying? The central canal, which is the connection or continuation of the fourth ventricle of the brainstem, right in the middle of the gray matter, right? So can you see that the central canal is in the gray matter? One side gray matter is connected to the other side gray matter by this band of gray matter in between, which is known as gray commissure. So this band of gray matter connecting one side to the other is known as gray commissure. Commissure fibers are fibers which connect one side to the other. So this is white matter. This part of white matter is called dorsal white matter. This is called lateral white matter. This is called ventral white matter. Okay. White matter is also known as, you'll also see in some areas, white matter is also given the name of funiculus. So this will be called the dorsal funiculus, lateral funiculus, and anterior funiculus. Now when we look at the gray matter, notice how this gray matter is kind of projected like a little horn up here. So this part is known as the dorsal horn. This part here is called the dorsal horn. This part here is the lateral horn, and this part here is the ventral horn, which you can see here, the ventral horn, and then up here, not labeled, so there's a little lateral horn up here. So lateral horn. So you can see a little lateral horn up here. This spinal cord is connected to a spinal nerve. Think of a spinal nerve like your telephone cable, which has incoming calls and outgoing calls. In the olden days, when we had operators, what they used to have that switchboard. We used to have the switchboard operators. So when someone called in, they would kind of plug it in on one side. And when somebody called and said, look, I want to make a call, they'd kind of pull the thing out that way, okay? So same way in our body, everything is so organized. So here is a spinal nerve, okay? This spinal nerve is carrying information which has to go towards the central nervous system. So it has to go towards the spinal cord, carrying sensory information. It also carries information from the spinal cord which has to go to muscles, which is motor information, right? Okay. So what happens is that in this spinal cord, it's like your telephone cable with incoming and outgoing calls. After that, what it decides, it's let me organize myself. Let me take all sensory fibers one way and let me bring out all motor fibers through another way. So this part of the spinal cord, this part of this nerve, the spinal nerve, has both sensory and motor fibers. After that, you have it where it's connected to the spinal cord. This spinal nerve splits into two parts. These two parts are known as roots. So this is called the dorsal root, This is called the ventral root, or also known as anterior root. Ventral for anterior, dorsal for posterior, because this is posterior and this is anterior. So this root will therefore be the dorsal or posterior root. This root will be the ventral or anterior root. So up here, notice in the dorsal root you have impulses which are going towards the spinal cord. So what would you call those impulses? Sensory or afferent, right? So all afferent impulses travel, they are traveling in the spinal nerve with the motor impulses, but the moment they reach close to the spinal cord, they all pass through the dorsal root, and they have their cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. If you remember, when we were doing that, we talked of types of neurons. We call them pseudo-unipolar neurons, right? So here you can see the pseudo-unipolar neurons in the dorsal root ganglion. So in other words, so let's say here is a person. So from his finger up here, let's say an impulse had to travel. So it will travel in this spinal nerve, sensory impulse, and then it will leave and go into this dorsal root, have its cell body there, and then go and synapse in the dorsal horn. So all sensory fibers travel through the dorsal root, and they have their pseudo-unipolar neuron cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglia. So it goes here. Let's say this is just a sensory impulse, nothing much has to be done, or the brain just, let's say you touch something, you don't have to react. Then from here, the impulses will travel all the way through the brain stem, then go to the parietal lobe of the brain. But let's say you need to react to it. Or maybe the brain has sent some information and a muscle has to contract. Let's say you decide, okay, I want to pick up this book or this pen. So information comes all the way down from the motor cortex, travels through all of the brain stem and everything, and all through all those tracts, and finally comes and relays on this ventral horn. And from the ventral horn, motor neurons start. These are multipolar. They travel out through the ventral root and they go to a muscle. So let's say they go to a muscle which allows you to, say the biceps, which allows you to flex. So here, this is information coming out of the spinal cord. So what will you call this information? Efferent. That's what you meant, right? Efferent. We'll say afferent and efferent just so that it's, or motor. So here you can see that sensory impulses travel through the dorsal root, motor impulses travel through the ventral root. Where is the cell body of the sensory neurons? In the dorsal root ganglion. Where is the cell body of motor neurons? Where does it begin? In this ventral horn. Can you see this? Begin, and these are multipolar. They begin here and they come out. Followed? Okay. In between, connecting this dorsal to the ventral root are again multipolar. They are called interneurons. Inter meaning between. So when we look at the white matter, I described some of it. White matter always contains axons. It is peripheral. As we said, there are 3 columns of white matter. White matter is also known as funiculi. Since this is where axons are present, this is where tracts will be seen. When the axons get together, we call them tracts. Ascending tracts carry information towards the brain. They are sensory. Motor tracts carry information from the brain and spinal cord and go out. So they'll be called descending. Based on the name, you can tell whether a tract is ascending or descending because you know the location of the various parts. So think of a tract which says corticospinal. What does it tell you? Where is it coming from? Cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. So that means it has to travel down. If it has to travel down, it will be a descending tract. So what kind of information will it have? Motor. Do you see that? If on the other hand, I tell you there's a tract called spinothalamic. That means going from spinal cord to the thalamus. Is the thalamus above the spinal cord or below the spinal cord? Above. So that means this tract has to go up, which means it has to ascend. Ascending were sensory tracts. Do you see that? So it would be a sensory tract. So just by the name, you can tell whether these tracts are ascending or descending, right? So let's look at the section of the spinal cord. So I'll just go back here. So these were the three white columns, or also known as funiculi. This is called posterior, this is called lateral, this is called ventral. So here is where all these tracts would be. So here, if we look at it, notice this is the same picture that I showed you, which I said from the, which we use for the brain stem. So this is the spinal cord. This is showing sensory, this is showing motor. So notice how these axons are lying all in the white matter. So here in the white matter of the spinal cord, these are descending tracts. They also lie in the white matter of the spinal cord, because axons will always be in the white matter. So they have very specific locations, because they can't just decide that I'm going to lie wherever I want. So if you take a section of the spinal cord, so here's a section of the spinal cord. You notice all these colored areas which are present. The blue is for ascending or sensory tracts. The red is for descending tracts. And notice how they are labeled. So this one here, for example, this one is called corticospinal. That means it's coming from the cortex to the spinal cord. It's also called lateral corticospinal, as the name suggests, because this is on the lateral side of the white matter. Look at this one here. Look at this particular one here, ventral corticospinal. See, because it's in the ventral part of the white matter, coming from the cortex to the spinal cord. So that's why it would be a descending tract. Look at this here. This is called dorsal spinocerebellum, meaning from the spinal cord going to the cerebellum, so traveling up. So it would be ascending. Since it's more dorsally placed, it's called dorsal. This one is more ventrally placed, so this one is called ventral spinocerebellum. So this is basically showing you the way these tracts go. So here is an ascending tract. So imagine someone scratches the bottom of your sole. The fibers will travel, they will go into the spinal nerve, since it's a sensation. Then they will go into the dorsal root. They'll have their cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. Synapse here in the dorsal horn of gray matter. The second neuron will cross over to the other side, because remember, from the right side it has to go to the left side, opposite half. Now it is traveling in the white matter, where it keeps it's joined by fibers coming up from other levels. So here it ends up forming a tract which is called spinothalamic tract. So this is ascending fibers. Look at descending fibers. Fibers coming from the brain. Again, notice how they are traveling in the white matter, and they come in synapse on the anterior horn cells. So that's how the cerebral cortex finally controls the anterior horn cells. And the final pathway is through motor neurons from the ventral horn, which comes out through this ventral root and goes through muscles. So all of these tracts have very, very specific areas. So imagine if there was a damage up here. What all would it injure? Not only would it injure the gray matter, it would also injure ascending and descending tracts. So a person will have both sensory loss and motor loss, right? And so, let's answer a few questions up here. So if you got a question like this about the spinothalamic tract, which of these statements would apply to it? Very good. It'll because it's going spinothalamic, it'll be an ascending tract and it will carry sensory information. So let's look at some lesions, some things which you might, you may be aware of. If sensory tracts, let's say there was a damage just to a sensory tract, which can happen, maybe there's a spinal cord injury or maybe there's a disease which has just affected some sensory tracts, then that person will have sensory loss. So the loss may be total, in which case they may not feel anything, which you call anesthesia, or they may feel altered sensation which is known as paresthesia. If, on the other hand, motor tracts are destroyed, imagine a tract coming down is destroyed, this will call paralysis because it cannot go to the anterior horn cells, which means it cannot pass out. So muscles will not have a final supply, so it'll call paralysis. So you've seen sometimes when people have had a stroke, you know how one half of the body is paralyzed, because imagine a tract is probably disturbed at that point and it can no longer carry information down to the spinal cord, which means the control over the spinal cord is gone, so the spinal cord cannot do its job. So you'll have paralysis. Some diseases, you may have heard of polio, you know, you all as children take the polio vaccine, or something known as Lou Gehrig syndrome, or also called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. They involve only motor neurons. So with the result, these patients have paralysis. In fact, Lou Gehrig's disease, which is ALS, is a really, really painful disease to watch, because a person is otherwise intellectually normal. They're able to, you know, see, understand, do everything, but they cannot move because they are paralyzed. So it is really, really awful to see. Some diseases like multiple sclerosis, which causes demyelination in the central nervous system, can demyelinate both sensory and motor tracts. So with the result, both sensations and muscle activity is involved. So the person loses sensation, also has muscle paralysis, depending on which area is involved. And, you know, therefore you can see that then this person can't feel very well, they can't also do, you know, perform certain movements. In fact, when people have spinal cord injuries like, you know, this person who acted as Superman, what was his name? Christopher Reeve, right. He had a spinal cord injury up in the cervical region. So imagine if you have an injury up in the cervical region. So what he had was, so here he severed his spinal cord up here. So no information from above can come down, no information from below can go up. Can you imagine? So then you have, everything is gone. So he had to be put on a respirator and have all kinds of, you know, different things like that. So all of these nerve injuries which you can see, or spinal cord injuries, you can explain based on, you know, which tracts are involved. Okay.